Hello and welcome to the first video in my Ask Me Anything series where I answer all your questions about photography and related topics. First, I got to give a big thanks to all of you who submitted questions. I'm really grateful for the opportunity that gives me to try and provide useful information. I want to start by saying that I never want to give the impression that I know all the answers because I don't. In fact, I'm more interested in what I don't know because it means that it keeps me excited about learning and discovering new things, and that lets me share more with you as well. For me, that's the only way to grow, to continue to ask questions, to remain curious about as many things as possible. And when it comes to art and creativity, that is even more important. So with that said, let's get started with some questions. I'm going to try to answer as many questions as I can in this video, but I definitely won't get around to all of them. So if I don't, I'll try to answer it in future videos. This first question comes from John. What do you recommend for a light travel tripod that can hold a DSLR with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens? It just so happens that I just did a review and a blog post about, I did a field test for the new FLM CP26, which I highly recommend. I think this will actually fit the bill. So check out that review on my website. Next question comes from Gerald. Is there something one can do on a daily basis, even without a camera, to practice, improve on compositional skills? This is a great question because it's one that I talk and write a lot about. And yes, there are many things you can do, although they're not easy. They're going to be more difficult. They're going to require a lot of effort and a lot of dedication. But here are a few ideas that I can share with you. Number one, and I've written about this as well, you have to develop your visual literacy. That means you have to increase the exposure to art forms that include lots of great composition, to become familiar with visual design. So looking at a lot of art, that's one thing that you can do while you're not using your camera. Not only photography, of course, but any art, any visual art form that has composition. This includes paintings, perhaps sculpture. You have to expose yourself to composition, and slowly but surely the ideas and the concepts of composition and what good composition looks like will begin to become more natural to you. Another way is to study composition from a good compositional book. There are many out there. I'll try to share some in the notes and tell you which books I think have been helpful for me. But you know, reading about composition and studying it as something that you want to learn, I think is more useful than simply just practicing composition, because it gives you a sort of a way to think more clearly about it. Finally, the hardest way, but I think one of the most beneficial and powerful ways, is learning how to draw. You don't have to learn how to draw to become an illustrator, but drawing forces you to practice composition on a piece of paper. And the better you do that, then the better you can actually exercise the same concepts when you take pictures. A great book that shows you how to do this is a book by Betty Edwards called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. I've talked about it a whole lot. And the book is actually meant for visual artists who don't necessarily want to learn how to draw, but want to learn how to move more easily between the left and right sides of their brain. This gets you more creative. And again, when it comes to composition, this is something that you can just simply do at any time, at any place. So those are some quick tips to help you to start to develop your composition. Thanks for the question. Next question comes from Jim. Have you got any preference for matting and framing up square prints? This is a kind of an interesting question because I don't think of square prints any differently from rectangular prints. In other words, for a standard rectangular print, let's say out of a DSLR, matting, I usually use a 2.5 inch to 3 inch border around the image as a mat. And if I were framing a square print, I haven't done this too much in the past, but I recall maybe 1 or 2 square prints, then I use the same sizing. So if it's a square print, I'll use a 2 inch or 2.5 inch mat, I mean that the border of the mat, all around the print, and that, again, that seems to work whether it's a square print or a rectangular one. So hopefully I understand the question, and if I do have it right, then yeah, I don't think it's any different than any other kind of print. Next question comes from Christopher. What is the best way to get into printing? it seems quite daunting and it's hard to know where to start. Any advice? Well, I'd have to say that number one, the reason I wrote a book on printing called Digital Fine Art Printing Field Guide for Photographers, and the reason I wrote the book, the impetus for me to write that book, was for this very reason, to break the concepts down into something that's simpler to understand, to make it less daunting for photographers to get into printing. So I would suggest that you check out my book, which is on Amazon or on my website. Secondly, take a good printing workshop. And once again, it's something that I've been doing for quite some time. My printing workshops, I strive to break the concepts down as simply as possible and make it easy for my students to get started, to build confidence quickly, and to see printing not as something that's daunting or intimidating, but as something that adds to their photography and is fun and creative and really brings a whole lot more depth to your photography. So that's my best answer for that there. Next question comes from John again, a different John, I assume. When I print on my 3880, the print is always darker. What is your recommended method to print? This is a very common thing with printing. A lot of photographers and students that I have tell me, and I also see this online, where people complain about their prints being too dark. Some printing experts even recommend that you always add a little bit of brightness to every print. You can do that in the Lightroom print module. I disagree with that recommendation simply because my prints are not too dark, and every single student that I've had in my printing workshop here has seen that your prints can match your monitor in terms of color and also in terms of luminosity. And I think one of the biggest culprits to this, and something that isn't talked about enough, is that most people have their monitors set too brightly. So if your monitor is too bright, if the brightness setting of your monitor is too high, then you're going to be a little more conservative in how bright you make your image, and then when you evaluate your print, it looks too dark. The second culprit might be that when you're evaluating your print, you have to remember that the print is a reflective medium, so it uses the light bouncing off of it from your light source, versus a monitor which is backlit. And today's monitors, really beautiful monitors from Apple or NEC or whatever company you're using, have a lot of backlighting, and your print has to compete with that backlighting, as it were. So you have to make sure that you're throwing enough light on the print so that it equals the amount of light coming off your monitor. If you use a good calibration device, one from X-Rite or from DataVision or Datacolor, the software will actually measure the ambient light level in your environment where you have your monitor, and also will allow you to will recommend the proper brightness setting for your monitor. And once you bring that brightness level down, not where Apple sets it at the Apple Store, because that's bright in order to attract, to make it attractive and to make you buy, right? But down where it should be for evaluating prints, I think you'll see that you won't have as much of a problem with prints being too dark. And ultimately, you can get to the, I think you can get to the place I have where your prints aren't dark at all. And then you have a much better environment, and you feel more confident about evaluating your prints. Next question comes from Jerry. Is it better to underexpose or overexpose a landscape photo? What if a third of the photo is sky? Underexposing or overexposing a capture really has nothing to do with whether it's a landscape or any other subject matter, or even whether what's in it, whether the sky is a third or anything like that. What it really entails, what it really is based on, is preserving detail either in the highlights or the shadows. So I think the question was about overexposing, but I guess it can go, we can discuss it in terms of underexposing as well. But in terms of overexposing, me personally, I never want to overexpose an image where the highlights have detail and I want to preserve those highlights. So that is the fundamental decision that you need to make. If you need to protect detail in the highlights, then you never want to overexpose, because once you overexpose, you're going to clip your highlights and you're going to lose that detail. On the other hand, you might have an image where you have really bright sunshine or something in an image. Let's say you're photographing at night and you have bright lights. Those are okay to overexpose because they're not going to have detail anyway. The dynamic range of that scene is too great for your camera to capture. So once again, use your histogram every single time you make an image, and learn to read the histogram so that you know when you're overexposing. And if you are overexposing, identify What's overexposing? Typically it might be the sky or clouds. And if you need to protect the highlights for detail, then don't overexpose. And that's really when you need to make that decision, or how to make that decision, not based on what you're photographing. Next question comes from Roger. When you return to an area to photograph often, how do you go about creating a new vision of the location? I just wrote a blog post about this recently, maybe 2 or 3 blog posts back, about photographing familiar locations. If you do a search on my blog, you'll actually find a couple of articles about this, because it's something that I do all the time. While I love to travel and visit new locations, I do a lot of my photography in the Hudson Valley where I live, for 2 reasons. One, it's easier for me and more convenient for me to get out into my own backyard, as it were. It's also beautiful, and also it challenges me to continue to find new ways to photograph the same places. So I think what's important is that you continuously try to see things in a new way, remain open and aware, get rid of judgment. Don't go out with the idea or the mindset that, oh, it's the same old thing again, I'm not gonna be able to see anything new. Basically, keep your eyes open, remain aware, and focus on what really matters, which is number 1, the light, and number 2, how you feel, how you're responding to the landscape. What is it that's different about it? I know for me, anytime I'm in nature, even if it's the same place in nature, there's always something wonderful about that. And you have to have that connection to your subject matter. If you don't feel that, well, that's something that you need to ask yourself. What is it that I'm photographing, and why am I photographing it? If you don't really have a connection for it, then of course, it's going to get to the point where you're not motivated. But if it is something that you're really passionate about, and nature for me is one of those things, I never feel like there's a lack of motivation. Yes, I have to find new ways to photograph if it's the same place, but light and nature has an amazing way to make the same thing look different. You just have to be willing to remain open and keep an open mind, okay? Next question comes from Jerry. Would you explain hyperfocal distance? Should I set my lens on infinity when I'm taking a photo of a landscape? Once again, hyperfocal distance is a concept that's a little difficult to explain in a short video, but I will attempt, and for that I need to jump in on my computer again and give you some basic pointers about hyperfocal distance. So hyperfocal distance is simply a distance in front of your camera, a specific point that when you focus on that point, everything from half that distance to infinity will be acceptably sharp. So once again, it's a specific point in front of your camera, let's say 5 feet, that when you focus at that point, when you focus at 5 feet, everything from half that distance, 2.5 feet, to infinity will be sharp, will be acceptably sharp. Now, the way to calculate the hyperfocal distance is to use some sort of calculator. There are some that are available online. DOFmaster.com is the one that I'm most familiar with and is very useful. There are also some apps that you can download for your mobile device that you can use in the field that allow you to calculate hyperfocal distance. And it's going to be based on your aperture and your focal length. So it's based on those 2 things will then determine what your hyperfocal distance is. In addition, it's also based on your camera sensor and its format. So you also have to put in what your camera is. But assuming you only have one camera, then you can always use that same variable, and you're going to change the focal length and the aperture setting. Another way to think of hyperfocal distance is that instead of changing your focal length and aperture setting, if there are particular settings that you like all the time, let's say for example f11 at 20 millimeters, because let's say you have a 20 millimeter prime lens and you like f11 because it gives you nice sharp images, then you can calculate what the actual hyperfocal distance is for that lens at f11. If you memorize that, which is what I did for many of my lenses, then you know how to approach a scene in the field, and you know how close you can get to an object, to your subject, and still have an image that's nice and sharp. And that's part of the way I've done it, so that I don't have to constantly be worrying about calculating the hyperfocal distance, but I know what they are for, let's say, f11 on a particular lens, and I know f11 gives me really good quality out of that lens. So let me show you some real-world examples. By the way, this is an app, or one of the apps that I use, PhotoPills, a great app that will calculate hyperfocal distance for you. So here's a scene in the landscape, and let's say I want to photograph this so that the shells on this rock here are sharp, and of course I want infinity to be sharp. So the hyperfocal distance is going to be a spot that is twice as far away from my camera lens as this spot here. So let's say it's going to be around here. So as I said before, hyperfocal distance, when I focus here, that is the important thing. When my focus point is there, everything from half that distance to infinity is going to be sharp. So let me jump over to dofmaster.com, and you can see here that I've selected my camera, which is the 1DS Mark III, and I've got my focal length at 20 millimeters. This could be either a prime lens, or perhaps it's a focal length that I like on a particular zoom lens. And when I put this in, you can see that it calculates for me the hyperfocal distance at each aperture setting on that lens. And if I use f16, and why f16 for me? Because it gives me the greatest amount of hyperfocal distance for that lens before I start to incur diffraction. And of course, diffraction is when you actually start to lose sharpness overall, because you know, the capabilities, the physical capabilities of the lens are starting to decrease, right? The performance of the lens is starting to decrease. You want to try to avoid diffraction when you can. That's why you don't just normally set the smallest aperture setting and you figure, well, now I can cover myself for any situation, because there is a cost to that, and that is diffraction. So on this particular, on my Canon lens, the 17-40 lens, f16 still gives me reasonably sharp, really sharp images without diffraction. So I try not to go any smaller than f16, and at f16, my hyperfocal distance is 3 feet. So if we jump back to the scene again, I have to focus 3 feet in front of this spot here. And that's going to be, or was, around there. This was around 3 feet away. This is pretty close to my camera, 1.5 feet. And even if I'm not sure, even if I'm not 100% sure how far away it is from my camera, I'm always going to, or you should anyhow, go a little bit further than what the hyperfocal distance is to give yourself some flexibility. So if it's 3 feet, you're always, it's always better to focus a little bit past that 3.5 feet, because then that'll just move your near limit. This is what they call the half, you know, what's in focus from half the distance to infinity, the near limit. It'll move it further away from you. But if you focus in front of the hyperfocal distance, let's say instead of at 3 feet, you focus at 2.5 feet, then you won't get infinity, or you might be in danger of not having your depth of field extend to infinity. And then, you know, you may not have the image that you thought you were making. Now, the tricky part here, I guess, is measuring exactly how far away things are from your lens, because most modern digital cameras don't have markings on the lens for distances and so forth. So you have to either do it by eye or use a tape measure, things like that. I've used tape measures in the field in the past, but I don't do it anymore. I just sort of approximate. And you also remember that even if you approximate, again, as long as you go a little further than what you think it is, you can either, you're going to lose a little bit in the near distance, or you can stop down a tiny bit more. So you can go from f16 to f18, for example, just to give yourself some insurance in case the situation calls for it. Let's go to another image. Oops, there we go. And I'm going to present this now in a different way, sort of the way that I go about making images. So instead of looking at the scene and deciding where my hyperfocal distance should be, I start with the premise that I know what my limitations are for my camera, and I know what the hyperfocal distance is for particular settings. So for example, with my Olympus camera, and this image I made with my Olympus, I have a 12mm prime lens. So because I'm using a prime lens, I don't have to think about the aperture and the focal length anymore, because that's set, so that can't be changed. And when I punch that in here, I get my hyperfocal distance for the different aperture settings. And let's say I don't want to use anything smaller than f8 because of diffraction, then I know this tells me that my hyperfocal distance is 4 feet, 3 feet 11 inches 4 feet. So now I know in the field, when I'm using that camera, that at f8, my hyperfocal distance is 4 feet. That simplifies things for me a great deal, because now when I approach a scene like this, I put that lens on and I dial it down to f8 to get nice depth of field. I know that I can't get any closer than 2 feet to an object that I want to maintain its sharpness. And when I get about 2 feet away from an object, I need to focus at a point 4 feet away, so that I now have 2 feet to infinity. So once again, I got about 2 feet away from this rock here, and I know that that's my near limit. And then I know that based on hyperfocal distance, I have to focus at a spot 4 feet away, which is about here. So my focus point was there. That's what I focused on. That gives me hyperfocal distance, near limit, which is going to be here, to infinity up here. The only time I would go to f11 on that camera and that lens, which would actually give me a hyperfocal distance of 3 feet, is, let's say I can't get 2 feet away from my subject, or I want to try something more creative, or anything like that. Then I'll get a little closer, but I can't get any closer than 1.5 feet, a foot, 8-10 inches, because otherwise I'm going to be within the near limit. The other thing to keep in mind also is that while this is what I want to be sharp, I don't need this to be perfectly sharp. And when things roll off from sharpness, it's not like they go from being sharp to not being sharp at all. It's a gradual decrease in sharpness. And because our eyes are attracted to things that are sharper, it basically will move the viewer's eye up to where I want things to be sharp, or where things are sharp. That's also where the light is. That's also where detail really starts to become obvious. So it's okay that things may go a little soft in the corners. I'm okay with that, given that, again, it makes the image a little more dynamic, a little more interesting, a little more variable. If you've got an image where every single thing is sharp from top to bottom, left to right, well, then it's like everything is calling for attention equally. So I hope this makes hyperfocal distance a little easier and clearer to understand, but obviously the best way to learn is to practice. Visit dofmaster.com. They actually explain what it is as well on their website. I think they do a good job of it. Print out one of the charts, practice, and slowly it should become easier to use and implement in the field. Next question comes from Kathy. Do you have a step-by-step process for importing and organizing your photos into Lightroom? If so, would you share it? Yes, I do have sort of a methodology that I use whenever I bring images into Lightroom. Let's jump into the import dialog, and I'll show you what that looks like. So in Lightroom, I do usually follow a particular workflow when I import images. That just keeps things simple and efficient for me, and it's based on how I like to work and my personal preference. But I think there are some tips that I can share with you that may help you as well. I'm going to click on import here. I have a card inserted into my camera. It shows me all the images that are on the card, and of course, if I uncheck one of the images, it won't import it. If they're all checked, then that means that they will all be imported. On the right hand side here, I always check where Lightroom is going to copy the images to. When you're importing from a camera card, you have no choice but to copy the images. And I'm going to change this to my external hard drive, where I store all of my raw files right here, and I put them inside of a folder called 2017 during 2017. That's all of the management that I do on my hard drive. I don't create any subfolders or anything like that. I prefer to use the power of Lightroom to allow me to filter and to search images by all of the metadata that's in the raw file. So if I need to find images by date, by time, by lens, by camera, all of that can be searched easily in Lightroom, and that frees me from having to do all kinds of organization in on my hard drive. Below that, in file handling, I usually have build previews at 1:1, which means that it'll build the largest preview possible while it's importing the images. I like to do that up front. I click on import and I leave for a while. And when I come back and sit down to work on my images and go through them, whenever I zoom into an image, there's no delay, and I can quickly move through editing images without having to wait for the previews to be built. So I do that at the beginning when I import them. I don't build smart previews unless I need to work with my catalog without my external hard drive attached, like for example on my laptop. But on my desktop here, I don't check that. That also will add some more time to the import. Below that, apply during import can be useful if you've got a workflow or you want to sort of speed things up. So for example, develop settings, I will select the develop settings that I use for this particular camera, which is my Olympus. And the develop settings just apply a few minor things to each file. So for example, they may apply a little bit of sharpening or a little bit of clarity or things like that. Just general adjustments that I like to add to each image. And of course, as I edit each image, I can always remove that or take that away. On a DSLR, on a non-mirrorless camera, the develop settings, a preset is even more important or more efficient because you can then have the preset apply lens correction, for example, which means that every time you import your images, lens correction is automatically turned on and applied to the images, and that again saves time. I also add my metadata, which is basically my copyright information when I import each image, and that's pretty easy to add. You just create a preset, and here's the one that I'm using, 2017, and it just puts in my copyright information for each image automatically when I import, and don't have to deal with that ever again. And then below that, another key recommendation is to enter keywords whenever you import images. Whatever keyword applies to every image that you're importing, the broadest category, for example, that's the one that I apply. So in this case, this is pretty specific because all of these images are from one outing in my neck of the woods here, Mount Beacon. So I can just type in Mount Beacon. I can also add another one called Hudson Valley. And those two keywords will be applied to every image. It just so happens that this is not my normal catalog. This is just a sample catalog. But on my normal catalog, I have my keywords in groupings. So you can have hierarchical keywords, which means that Mount Beacon is inside of the Hudson Valley keyword. And so when I enter Mount Beacon, it automatically applies Hudson Valley. So it's quite useful and very powerful to create a sort of a category of keywords. You can have a local park inside of your local county, inside of your city, inside of your state, and applying the most local keyword will apply all the parent keywords, as it were. All right, so that can be very, very powerful. So once I do that, I hit import, and Lightroom then imports the images and builds the previews. And I've sped the video up here a little bit to save you the wait. Once they're in, then I will jump into the library module, and I can hit Z to zoom in, and then I will use my left and right bracket keys to go through the images. And I like to use the star ratings to rate images. They give me a little bit more precision than, let's say, the flag. The flag is either, an image is either flagged or it isn't, but the stars give me a way of marking how much I like it. And for me personally, I use 2 stars to indicate that an image is interesting in some way or another. In other words, it's better than, let's say, most of the images. And then I use 3-star to tell me that it's an image that I really like and I'm actually may be willing to spend some time developing it. And then a 4-star image, which I don't usually get to while I'm in the preliminary stages of importing and evaluating my images, but a 4-star image is one that I really like. I'm going to take a lot of time to develop it, and I'm probably going to print it. So as I go through here, I can look at these images. Maybe that's one that just jumps out at me for whatever reason. I'm not thinking too much at this point about what I like about it or what I don't like about it. I'm just going on a gut reaction, a gut feeling. I'll press the number 2 to give it a 2-star rating. Maybe there's another one there. I'll hit 2 stars. Maybe that's one there. I'll hit 2 stars. And maybe this one here, I'll give it 2 stars. Again, no particular I'm not doing any deep analysis. It's simply just going through them and seeing what jumps out at me, what I find interesting. Once I'm done with that stage, then I will open the filter bar up here. And the way you do that is by hitting the # key. And then I can filter by 2-star images. So I click on attribute, and stars is an attribute of an image. And then down here, I say, show me images that are 2 stars or greater. And once I do that, now I've filtered down my images just to those images that I found interesting for some reason or another. And I do the same process again. So I'll go through these images, and if I find that some of these are worth developing, and they may be all, and that's okay if they're all, I'll give them all 3 stars. But if I don't want to edit all of them, let's say this one 3-star, maybe this is a 3-star. I really like these two. Then I can come up to my filter bar again and filter by 3 stars. And now I'm left with these 2 images. And then I can proceed to work with them and develop them and see what happens, so forth. And so that makes it very easy for me to kind of go from my entire import to images that, the images that I only want to look at. And if you import 50, 100, 200 images, you can go quickly through them. And again, this is a process that should be fairly efficient for you. So you're not spending a lot of time working on one image. You just want to get through the whole and kind of start to slowly cull the images down to a group that you feel really positive about. Now, as far as organization beyond that, if I go back to my library, I use the 2-star, or I should say I use the star ratings to be able to find images, and I use keywords. So if I'm in the future, I'm looking for 3-star images from Mount Beacon, then I would go over to the keyword list here, and I would select Mount Beacon, click on this right arrow. This shows me all the images from Mount Beacon, and then I can switch over to the attributes and say, just show me 3 stars. So these are 3 stars from Mount Beacon. And if I wanted to make it easier to find these images, for example, what originally we used folders for, I use collections. Collections are extremely powerful. So I can create a new collection here, and I'll call it Mount Beacon. And hit create. And same thing, I can turn off the filter bar. So again, I'm looking at all images from my import. I can select them all by hitting Command or Control A. I can drag these over into the Mount Beacon collection. And now this collection here are all my images from Mount Beacon, and same thing as before. I can click on attribute up here and just filter down by stars. Just like that. So if you allow Lightroom to manage your library based on the metadata, there's a lot of rich metadata in every single image that you're making, then it becomes very easy and powerful to search and find anything really quickly, as long as you do a little bit of work up front. For example, entering keywords, that's really the key thing. But otherwise, I can search and find images much faster than I ever could in the past using a folder system, where I'm always subject to losing things or placing them in the wrong place, or mixing up my, getting my spelling wrong, etc. This way is, I think, much more efficient. And so that's kind of an overview of how I like to manage my Lightroom catalog. Amrut, I hope I pronounced that correctly. I have come across many photography articles, blogs, and videos that suggest think quality over quantity. I'd like to know what tips you'd give me to make this switch right now. Well, in general, I think when you start your path as a digital photographer, it's so easy to make images. There's no cost whatsoever. We've got unlimited amounts of picture taking capability, unlike in the film days, that it's easy to sort of just make lots and lots and lots of images to get trigger happy, as it were, or shutter happy. I think over time what happens is that perhaps you start to see that it's better when you take your time, when you're a little more methodical, when you consider your images a little more closely. And so I think I would say that there's a couple of ways that you could, I think, implement shooting quality over quantity. Some practical ways. For example, make believe that you don't have unlimited amounts of storage in your card, that perhaps you only have 36 exposures or 48 exposures like you would shooting film. And that might be a way to force you to think twice about whether the picture you're about to make is the best one or you can wait a little while. So that's one way. Just basically put these limitations on yourself. And by the way, that leads to another idea that I've shared often, which is that one of the best ways to become more creative is to give yourself limitations, to limit yourself, to limit your creative possibilities. Because when you limit yourself, when you put constraints on yourself in one way or another, then that forces you, A, to focus on that area and on the particular problem. It forces you to focus on the problem. And B, that often drives creativity. It drives you to come up with solutions to problems because you're clearly defining what the problem is. And so you can imagine if you are photographing and you only got, you're limiting yourself to 48 exposures, well, now you've got 48 and you've got to really be careful about how you use them. Whereas if you don't have that limitation, you can simply just fire away and not really worry about it. So I think that's one way to approach it. And the second way, I guess, is to just become a little more patient, to let go of the constant drive to want to make an image and let yourself wander a little more. Let yourself explore. Let your see what happens as you look more deeper on, onto your scene or the subject that you're evaluating. Again, just become a little more patient and resist the drive to want to make a picture as often as possible. And I think this way, if you think quality, of course, maybe you can start to judge your sort of your instinct to want to make an image and improve your quality of the quality of your images. Next question comes from Scott. Scott wrote a long paragraph, but its basic question is, when is a landscape photo more than just a pretty picture and considered art? This is another somewhat complex question with no clear answer. And I think if you ask several people, you're going to get different answers. But I would say that the best art, and whether we're talking about photography or any other art form, it doesn't really matter from my perspective. The best art is the art that communicates something to the viewer, to the listener, to the reader. It's art where when you feel that you're getting something personal from the author, the writer, the musician, the photographer. So I think art is about expressing an opinion. It's about expressing how you feel about your subject matter. In this case, if you're a landscape photographer, how you feel about the landscape. And if you're not conveying anything, then maybe it's not quite art and it's more of a snapshot. So we often say, if you're just making snapshots, you're showing someone else what something looks like, in which case they can see it themselves, they can photograph it themselves. But if you photograph it in a way that shows them a little more than what it looks like, how you see it, how you perceive it, what you feel about it, the kind of emotional response that, or the emotional connection that you have to it, if you can somehow get through that through your image, then I think that you're going a step further than simply making a snapshot, and that's when you go into the realm of creating art. So art is not this mysterious, ambiguous thing that is elusive or difficult to get at. I think it's within the grasp and reach of any of us. Any of us can be artists. It's just a question of approaching it with the right mindset and thinking about exactly what it is that you're trying to achieve. Basically, it's when you can induce some sense of awe, wonder, some sense of connection in the viewer, and you can do this repeatedly. In other words, a good piece of art has to be able to do this more than once. It has to do it over and over again. And if you think about great art, no matter how many times you look at it, there's something about it that is enjoyable. So I think that's how you have to think about it. But there's a lot more that I can say about this. Do some research, do a search on my blog, because I've written about this subject in the past. All right, last question comes from Andrea. I try to go out and photograph as much as possible and shoot out of my comfort zone. However, I feel I have plateaued. How do I keep getting progressively better? Well, for me, I can only answer how I've tackled this problem for myself, for me. And one way is to take a break. Sometimes you need to step away from making art or from something that you're trying to solve, because it's when you step away and you let your subconscious take over that then a lot of creative ideas come out. And if you read any great books on art and artists, you'll discover that that's one of their key techniques, which is to let go of trying to figure things out and then let your mind, your subconscious mind, work on the problem. So that's one way, maybe to just let go of the attachment. I've talked about this idea of attachment a lot. People go out into the landscape, to go out into nature, and they have this drive to make images. And I think if you just go out to see how it feels, to see what happens, to respond, to let go of the drive to make images, and just be present, I think that helps a lot. A second way is to maybe challenge yourself and start making images that you're not used to making, to get a little bit out of your comfort zone. I know you mentioned that, but maybe you need to try it in a different way. I've done things like only use prime lenses, or perhaps try to only photograph certain kinds of subject matter, or maybe only photograph at certain times of the day, maybe just in the afternoon instead of at sunrise or sunset. So anything that allows you to see things a little differently. Maybe take a workshop with someone that you think can give you some insights, or maybe go out and photograph with friends or other people that maybe have a different way of doing things that you may not be aware of, and that might open you up to looking and thinking about things in a new way. And finally, explore other art forms. Look at paintings, think about what you like in those paintings and how to relate to what you're trying to do with photography. Any art form, I think, can add to your creative sort of well, and that well is the thing that you draw on to make images. So again, I just think a little bit more broader exposure. Don't read photography magazines as much. Get away from photography and look at other art forms. And I think that might help to get away from perhaps doing things the way that you feel that you've been doing them too long, and you feel plateaued and stuck. All right, so I think that wraps it up for this video. Once again, thank you for all the questions. It's been a great opportunity to answer them. I hope the answers have been helpful, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.